pedagogy has come up quite a bit in this discussion, but in sort of this kind of way. It comes up, it pokes its nose up, and then it resubmerges like the Loch Ness Monster. So I'm glad we have a panel where we can actually talk a bit about it and about the consequences of all this, partly because this whole event arose in a conversation that Fotis and I had a few years ago about how hard it would be to teach data modeling in a humanities context because of the lack of discourse, the lack of existing published materials, the lack of source material. And so the pedagogical motive is very strong in this event. So anyway, there were 3 or 4 questions which we had sort of posed to you to start things off. And they are, and I'm sorry, I guess I don't have them up there. But first of all, what's distinctive about humanities data modeling as opposed to, or as distinct from, the modeling of data in other fields from a specifically pedagogical perspective? So what's distinctive about teaching data modeling in a humanities context? How have you found it coming up perhaps in your own teaching? And the second question is, what value does data modeling hold for the digital humanities classroom, or in other quasi-pedagogical contexts, for example, ongoing professional development? As traditional humanists retrain as digital humanists, what value does data modeling hold in that sort of professional transformation that the field may be undergoing? The third question was, what kinds of conceptual challenges do humanists face in understanding data modeling as part of their work, or in understanding it at all, maybe is another question. And finally, consider strategies for teaching data modeling, again, broadly speaking, to humanists. What kinds of explanatory models have you seen working particularly well or particularly poorly? So I'm putting those questions out to kind of paradigmatically to start things off, but maybe then I can just repeat the first question as a starting point. What's distinctive about humanities data modeling as distinct from the modeling that might happen in other fields from a pedagogical perspective? Or what's distinctive about teaching data modeling in a humanities context, that kind of thing? I wonder if you could. And if that's a terrible starting point, feel free to pick one of the other questions to start with. you can have an insurrection and say, we hate that question.
Because I have no idea. That's the answer. I just teach modeling in the humanities, so I have no idea what people in mathematics teach or in other fields. I know what it is teaching to, not only in the humanities, but to my specific community, which is even different, okay? So I do think it's much helpful more helpful for myself not to answer to this question because I don't have an answer, but go to the other point if you...
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Let's take that question off the table until we're ready for it.
I don't know, as I started. The second question otherwise is, what does the data modeling hold for the digital humanities classroom is very relevant for me. It's the main, is what, what I teach. I teach XML, XSLT, TI, all these kind of things, as well as other things, but this is the most important bit of my teaching. I teach undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD students. So what I teach to these people that are not very happy to be taught technical things, I have to say, they normally resist a lot. When I do start on the modeling side of things, otherwise, they feel back as they are humanist again. So they don't have to learn angle brackets. They kind of take a breath and they understand. Is actually the moment in which all the teaching I've been doing, all the conveying of the technical bits makes sense, because they start to understand how to use that, to use what they know as humanities people and their own knowledge to put it into angle brackets. And it's the moment in which the click happens and they're much happier after. What is the challenge that they face? I do think the most important challenge is the fact they are not used to look at the data in the way we need them to look at them the moment they start modeling. So they have to look at exactly the same data they've always been looking, their texts, basically, but in a different perspective, looking at different features. So that's the part that is very hard for them, and we need to reiterate the same action. So going through the document and say, okay, this is a feature, and say, oh, right. I've never thought about that. Yes, I know it's a title, I know it's a name, but doesn't mean what does it mean that? And they say it is a name, and it's something you may choose or not to encode. Wow. And that is the part that is challenging for them. So looking at the material they are familiar with, but with a different eye. And the strategies that works, I have two different strategies normally I use. The first is what I call the top-down approach, meaning what you want to achieve. Visualize your website, the final website, what you want to do, and think backward what you need to do, to process, to achieve that result. Because it's easier for them to understand, thinking of the final product than thinking of the document they have and model it from there. So that's what I call the top-down approach. The second one is what I call the theoretical rich approach, which is making them reflect on the modeling that they already know. For instance, the theory of communication, Jacobson, Saussure, those are models of language, of communication that most of them are familiar with because they studied at the undergraduate level. So, okay, this is a model. Think on this term. So using the models they already are familiar with to apply to the documents and start to make them understand what they actually do. They're applying those models somehow. And that helps because, again, they are back on their familiar knowledge and they can make the step forward to something that is more unfamiliar. And therefore, that's the second approach. The third trick, that I call the trick, it's not a method, it's a trick, is to use material they are familiar with. So if I'm talking to medievalists, use medieval manuscripts. If I'm talking to epigraphists, use stones. If I use to Italians, to colors, Italian material, and so far on. Something that I know they are expert on. So I can show them what they can do with their own material. That is my trick.
Can you repeat the names of your first two?
Sorry?
Can you repeat the names of your first two methods which weren't tricks?
Okay, the first is called the top-down. I mean, from the end, so the final results. We use normally wireframing. So we do the wireframe, the final website, or mock up the website, and work backwards. And the second that I said is the theoretically rich. Rich, exactly. So I got on all the theories that I've been hearing, structuralists, post-structuralists, and try to make think that they can actually think them into XML. And that is the second model. That's just to answer the fourth question.
So perhaps I take over. My background is a bit further away from digital humanities in the end. I mean, I teach Romance linguistics. Now, okay, linguistics in a very broad sense. That means also perhaps the history of the science and sociolinguistics and all these sort of things. But in my courses, I always do not just want to teach my students something about linguistics, but also something about research methods and something about how you do research, actually, and above all, sound scientific approaches. That means, for example, also academic paper writing. Now, my students in Roman studies, as Elena already said, I mean, all these things which we are doing nowadays, markup, ontologies, data, and all these sort of concepts in a way, they have been always implicit. Nobody ever talked about data, even if a text was always there. Everybody used text or filing cabinets with what these small cards, Karteikarten are called, yeah, in boxes, yeah. You ordered them, you created some sort of ontology in the end, and you set up relations between them. But nobody ever looked at them like this, and so doing research was also always much more, and also writing scholarly paper was always looked upon as much more sort of a creative, mental, I don't know what sort of process. Yeah? And this is still the case in most in Roman studies in the end, because even with the computer there was no way of working or no approach which would teach students also a sensible to exploit sensibly the technology to do all the work. So this is not in place. So my students normally They arrive at the class, they write an academic paper, but they're not even conscious that the layout is a structure, what is a text, that a text is a structured entity, that there's a systematic layout, that things mean things, yeah. And they've got no idea about data, and it's very difficult for them even to set links between the sources they use inside a text and the bibliography. All these sort of concepts are not really explicit, implicitly, but it's not very consistent. So anyway, the approach I've been taking lately was to set up a project where the research question was about what is the influence of the neo-grammarians on Romance linguistics. And during this project, I asked, students had to mark up texts because the texts needed to be included in this portal we created. So by marking up text and using Oxygen, for example, they learn a lot about text. Yeah? They, first of all, notice that even their own texts, which they've never realized before, they are always marked up. And so they understand what markup is actually about, and that there is a structure, and if you define these elements, you can also change them. They also learn that rendering is a different level from the data itself. And another sort of thing which works really well, or worked very well during this project, was actually EndNote, because EndNote, the database it offers, the students had to insert the data they collected for their project, and they had to learn that you have to respect the fields, that different publications have different information bits they need. They also learned that style sheets can be applied to consistently entered data, and that you can even change the rendering and the data remain the same. And integrating all this together is what actually I would hope for, conceptual change. Also that students do not look at computers any longer as a typewriter. And that's what they actually do, but also as a document, an academic paper, as a document which is structured, which I can change. The whole thing is a process anyway of writing such a paper nowadays, because by applying a different output, I can change the whole structure of a paper. All these sort of things. So I think altogether it should change their whole understanding of what they are actually doing, and that's the most important thing.
Could add to that. I don't teach data modeling per se, I teach literature. And yet, I think that there are certain things in terms of data structures that are extremely useful for teaching literature. And one of them is teaching them formalism, the elements of works, and how things hang together. And one thing I like to do, just to show students how it is that the texts that they read online are marked up, are tagged, are coming to them, very highly mediated, is show them this very wonderful, simple example from the TEI standards of Blake's Rose, Thou Art Sick, right? I say, oh, you see this, and you're familiar with it, and you've had it in your high school literature classes, and here you see it online, and perhaps what you don't realize is that there's all sorts of data attached to this poem so that you can enjoy it and see it and read it. But at the same time, if you look at these lines, you have a way to parse this poem. We realize simply by looking at the structure of this poem that it's comprised of lines and stanzas, and this is actually a very useful tool for students who I can sympathize, who might not be interested in or resistant. They might be resistant to learning technical skills. I assure you they're also resistant to literary analysis. Yeah, exactly right. And so this actually, in some ways, provides them, I can do this. I see this, this whole idea of a formal analysis is not perhaps as abstract as it seems. Here is actually a way that it's done in a very simple framework. So that's something I find extremely useful in terms of teaching literature. And I'm also always on the lookout for the wonderful types of visualizations that we saw yesterday with Wendell's presentation, that we saw earlier today with Vannevar Bush, et cetera. And so I think these are things that I use in my pedagogy, and I think I'd like to see more of in my own teaching.
So,
Grab the mic.
oh, sorry, and I don't speak so loud. So I've gone from a position of not teaching for a long time, maybe the odd, to doing almost it seems well. I don't say nothing but teaching, but teaching a lot. I started a master's, there's a PhD at Trinity, and I teach undergraduate. And I'm realizing for certainly the master's and PhD, the methods that I've used, I think, don't serve me or my students. I hope they're not listening. Because I used to teach one course, and how much you can get through in one course is very different from teaching a whole master's, even though in Ireland our years our master's is just 1 year. So I'm very grateful actually to Fotis and Julia for having this symposium now, because I had started to rethink how I might teach. And this gave me an opportunity to think quite differently. And what happens if I frame particularly some of the more introductory courses in terms of modeling? I'm not sure I'm going to call it that, because I think that might scare some people away. In any way, it's a big deal to change a course name. But it seems to me that there's maybe 4 different, not mutually exclusive approaches. One is teaching modeling through theory, something very theoretical, or something very practical, that you're teaching them modeling, but not from a theoretical point of view by doing it, or by having them model something, and as I said, not telling them what they're doing. And so it seems to me that when we were talking, I think it was yesterday or was it this morning, about teaching research methods as well, not only to our students in digital humanities, but all the other students who do research methods, how important it is, and I hadn't thought of that before, to teach them the kind of skills that's going to help them manage and model the information. Sorry.
So they are complaining online that they don't hear.
Yeah. Sorry. That in fact I think we're going to be doing a disservice to our professions if we don't teach the next generation of students how to in fact model their own data. Because this is how we all collect data now. As someone said, you go into libraries, take photographs, we have a lot of Word documents. You try to find them on your hard drive, you put them on Dropbox, and then do searches to see if you can find them. So it seems to me, even in training, which I've done a lot of, run summer schools, data modeling always seems to be implicit. I don't think I've ever seen, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, in a digital humanities summer school, certainly not one that I've done, or maybe unfortunately, there is no data modeling course. We teach it implicitly, so we teach XML, and there's data modeling, or we teach XSLT, or we teach something else, and it's implicit, but nobody signs into, so it seems to me that we're missing a whole level. And it was a question that maybe we started, what's different? And as well, I have not taught in computer science departments, but I suspect one of the differences is that we don't have data modeling as a kind of primary method that we teach apart from the technologies themselves. And so it seems to me it's that thing, if you teach someone how to fish, they can eat for a long time. If we're teaching them XML or we're teaching them a particular technology, then they know how to do that. But it seems to me what we probably should be teaching them is a level up, so that when the new technology comes along, as it will in their lifetimes if they stay in this field, they can then apply that knowledge that we've taught them to the new technology, as opposed to having to learn each one separately. So I had a recent experience, and it came up around the time I've been thinking about this for this workshop. And I asked my students, as part of a kind of digital scholarly editing course, to evaluate other thematic research collections. And they did, and they wrote about it in the old style. And they did very well. And then I asked them for their own projects to do wireframes of theirs. And they didn't do so well. And it seemed to me they didn't make that leap between what they understood when they evaluated in text the other thematic research collections, and what I was asking them to do was to create an abstract model of the site they were going to create. So then I thought, well, maybe there's a different approach. Of course, there's always a different approach. And I thought, well, what happens if I ask them to model a thematic research collection as an exercise? And I asked one group to model it in XML, and I asked another group to use PowerPoint and do it that way, because it's the model that's important, not the language that they're using to model. And that would also teach the kinds of things that you were also talking about, that it's not the language that we use to express it, but the underlying, the concepts either under or overlying it. So it seems to me, the last point I made, also in preparation for this, I looked up, because I remembered that when UVA was thinking of doing a master's in digital humanities, they put a lot of information online. And I remembered, in fact, I went back to look, that 2 of the core modules are knowledge representation. And I remember that this came about, this course that didn't come about actually, but a lot of work is online about it. After a series of kind of discussions and workshops that they had at UVA to try to figure out what could a digital humanities master's look like. And I was struck again by the centrality of the knowledge representation courses in this.
This is fascinating. I mean, what I'm hearing from these different examples is a number of different approaches that come from different disciplinary perspectives. And I wonder whether you guys, and also then obviously this is open, could speak to the question of, if we are to teach data modeling, if we're responding to the urge to make it an explicit part of our pedagogy, is that something that can be done outside of a disciplinary context or in a trans or interdisciplinary context? Could you teach a course on data modeling for, say, humanities graduate students? Or would it need to be, for classicists, for literary students, for linguists, right? Is there a way we could imagine data modeling as a topic in itself in a humanities context?
Well, what I do teach is to digital humanities students that have all sorts of background. Okay. So they don't have one type of background. And I do use different examples, so I think you can do that. It is, there is things that are very specific. Actually, I do teach text, so they need to be text grounded. But text is something that is common on most humanities background. So I just make sure that they take some documents and material we look at, which is of wide interest. The last we used was the Gettysburg Address, which was, there is a lot of digital images, the different versions, so it was a very good example. And something can be interesting for many backgrounds, to be honest. So that was the reason I chose something that is iconic, that's what I mean.
You're having insurrection on the live stream.
Okay. You got to get closer.
It's not working very well, this one.
Okay.
Well, I'm hearing.
Okay.
Play very heavy things.
Thank you for the
This one works.
I agreed with what she said before concerning the importance of working on sources which are very close to the domain of expertise of the students, their background domain. And I think it is a matter of giving confidence, of giving technical confidence to the students. It means to make them be in the position to say, look, I know myself. As a linguist, I've got some concepts I've acquired on my previous year of training. As an historian, I've got some concepts. I take a document, and this guy is asking me to put this together as an XML document. I've just heard what XML was 5 minutes ago, and I discover I can do that because I understand the material. So I think it is very essential. So if you've got a heterogeneous class, you need to know how to organize that in subgroups where they can have this epiphany moment, you know, where they say, aha, yeah, I can build up my concept as something more technical than I thought. So it's a very important issue.
Is there anything besides the knowledge they already have on general concepts where you think, beyond the level of XML or this kind of knowledge, they say, this is so basic to data modeling, they have to know about it without any relevance when what kind of study they're doing. like indirection, abstraction, things like that could be something.
That's what I use the theory-rich approach, in a sense, because I build on theory that they already know, and the point is to make them, they shift from the empirical of looking at specific to the abstraction, and to make the model become abstract. They do already in many circumstances, because if you look at the theory of communication, the theory of literature, language, which they are familiar, they are able to understand the signifier and the significant, for instance, what it is. But that's a moment in which the abstraction already happens. So that's how I use it, and for these reasons.
So I'm just about the furthest thing from someone who's an expert in pedagogy, just to. But the thought occurs to me, if I want to teach about modeling, I wonder if we don't divorce ourselves a little bit from the idea that this is data modeling, or the idea that this is knowledge representation, and rather think to ourselves, what we want to teach first is just information management. And couched that way, maybe I'm wrong, to me it doesn't sound as scary. And then rather than taking, I'm answering Julie's question, can we do this for a broad spectrum of people rather than directly aimed at certain disciplines? Well, all of us have experience in certain things that we could take advantage of. One that jumps to mind is saying, using your first example of information model was what information do you want to collect to keep track of your own personal collection of photographs? Or something like that, that everyone can get their teeth into. You want to know who took the picture, what camera you used, what day, who's in the picture, stuff like that. Model that first, and then step into texts in disciplines that students have some access to and teach. Is that a reasonable thought, or am I being crazy?
It's not for me, not in my experience. The students, especially, the higher you go on postgraduate, on PhD students, they regard this as patronizing. They say, you know what, I know these things. I'm a PhD student, treat me as an adult. So they want really to get directly on something that is relevant for what they do. It doesn't work if you don't give them a challenge or some material that is likely to be part of their experience. That is my experience, though. Maybe.
And undergraduates too? Or?
It's weird, they don't react that much today. No, sorry, I'm very naughty. But it's difficult for the undergraduate students because they normally listen to you and nod a lot, whatever you do. Sorry, Susan.
Oh yeah, I was going to maybe respond to Fotis. I was again rereading things about modeling, and I was looking at Willard's article in the companion to Digital Humanities again, and he broke down modeling into these 5 areas: analogy, representation, diagram, map, simulation, and experiment. And again, it's a kind of step up. I wonder if a model, as it were, like that, could serve as a way to teach modeling, but not specifically about a particular language or tool, or and abstract out and demonstrate how these become models, and how we use them, and both theoretically and very practically.
I don't know whether you mean that one ought to teach modeling or knowledge education without any tools or without a specific tool. But it seems to me that, especially if it's without any tool, I guess is what I'm responding to. So it seems to me that if you're talking about teaching humanities students who want to work on something specific, or who hope will work on something specific, the tool is how you test things. And one of the real ahas for this kind of thing is when someone realizes, whether by abstraction or some other abstraction of what comes to mind, that things start to fall into place, that your model makes sense because you can answer a question with it. And I think you can only do that when you have a tool that you're playing with. Maybe you're not focusing on learning the tool, and that you want to play around it.
Yeah, I think that's the point, that often I think we teach tools,
Yeah.
and then, I don't know what word to use, presume they get it, or they get something,
Right.
but it might not be something they can abstract to the next tool that comes along. So the tool becomes the vehicle, not the purpose.
So no hands.
Yeah.
In a room full of technologists, we had turned the mic off.
So I checked it. Oh well.
Yeah, I'm really drawn to this question because I think I want what both Susan and Elena suggested exactly. I want the best. I want both things to happen, right? I love this one level up idea, you know, but I also, you know, and so I teach programming, right? And the thing you're trying to say when you're teaching programming is, okay, we're going to learn this particular language, this particular tool. And then at the same time, you want to say, by the way, forget completely about the tool, because the tool doesn't matter. We're talking about concepts. And they go, and then they go deeper and deeper into the tool. And no, wait, stop that. You know? So you're going back and forth. And one way I've tried to get around this is by constantly peppering the discussion of a specific technology with as many sort of anecdotes about other technologies that I can fit in. So talking about Ruby, and suddenly this is how Java does it. This is how Lisp thinks about it. This is how Haskell does it. And I risk confusing them completely. But I almost feel like that's a worthwhile risk. And so if I were teaching XML, data modeling, I think what I want to do is sort of let's make sort of XML our own day, sort of the humanities department today. So let's try to sort of like take them off the beam as often as we can in trying to say, by the way, if we were talking about relational databases, in fact, let's talk about that. Here's how it would look. It'd be completely different sort of ideas. But I'm glad both of those came up because I just think that's exactly what I want, both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely, because in a way what you're teaching them is you can express this in XML, or you can express in a relational database, and here's what doesn't work maybe, but have them figure it out. So, could a way of teaching this be to set a problem, as I said before maybe, and have, if you have groups working, have them work in the different technologies, or have them model the same thing in different technologies, but some way of allowing them to get to that space that you're trying to give them with other examples. I don't know if this will work either, but it's exactly what you're talking about, which I imagine was the original question. Do they do this differently in engineering or computer science and mathematics, so that once you learn one language, it's fairly easy to pick up another, because it's the concepts that are important,
well, it's also
not the
a question
expression.
of institutional strategy. I mean, I know in many American universities, the question is, if we're going to teach topics like this, where do they get taught? Do they need to be taught in the departments? Do they need to be taught across departments? Do you benefit from having archaeologists and linguists and Romance languages people all in the same classroom learning data modeling, or do you benefit from having each group being taught separately? And I think interesting way this maps onto the phrase "getting your hands dirty" that came into the discussion yesterday, and really makes us ask: do we think of modeling as the new version of the liberal education? Right? It's like the classics in 19th century British education system, where once you know that, you know everything, and you can go everywhere. Or is it more like chemistry or engineering, where once you know it, you can do a bunch of stuff? And that, I think, bears on the question of whether what happens when a scholar understands modeling is that they're getting their hands dirty, or on the contrary, that they're keeping them very clean.
I like this idea of the fact that Stephen was suggesting or presenting older programming language. What I tend to do for that precise purposes is to say, okay, I'm not teaching everything. I'm teaching XML, TI, XSLT, and CSS in 20 hours. I mean, it's kind of a big challenge, and Trevor can say that because he was in my classes. I always say that I can teach you like 40% of, and relax in G as well, sorry. I teach you 40% of that, 30% of that, 40%, 20%, 5%. The rest is yours, because I want you to learn how to learn, not the technology itself. So the fact that in a course I teach so many technology at once, in a sense, and all of them are to be used together, makes some sense. And the fact that they have to go and learn by themselves a lot, because Otherwise, say, you know, in 5 years, then technology will be obsolete. So what you are up, we're not preparing you for 5 years work, but we want to prepare you to become a digital humanities person that goes there and learn a new technology in 5 years' time. So you have to learn how to learn, and that's what is assessed as well.
I was just going to respond to what you just asked, Julie, because I, like Elena, teach whoever signs into the digital humanities course. But I think there's an advantage to having different disciplines there, because the advantage to just having your own discipline, it does make it easier. But the other advantage is that you get people who understand or will represent the same objects very differently, because they come from different theoretical and disciplinary backgrounds. And allowing students to see how others do that representation or the knowledge they take out of it, I think is stronger than possibly the benefit of having all the same types of people in the room.
There's more people, but after I would like to say.
Okay, Desmond.
I just wanted to progress that a little bit and say, ask the question, is there anything abstract we can teach digital humanities students about data modeling? Or is it really just about XML or about relational database? I don't think there is anything much abstract. I think it's almost all tied to reality. I think the analogy with programming languages is not a perfect one. You've got many different similar programming languages that are all imperative or they're all functional or whatever. One can to some extent swap between them. But the database model, relational database model, and XML are not exactly similar. I think what you've been describing is just teaching XML data modeling. I think that's all we can do.
It kind of relates to that. Still trying to get into the level where there are any abstractions worthwhile conveying without saying at the level of teaching XML. One of them is, I found that every model is a model under a certain perspective. So we want to make this point very clear from the very beginning. They don't think they model some ontology or some things really out there, but it's a model under a certain perspective. And usually as a researcher, talking to young researchers, you try to say, okay, you will have a research question and then you model the stuff for yourself. But they don't have any research questions. And basically, I'm very happy to ask around. Do you have an answer how to do this? How to make them think up research questions? If they're just, I mean, I'm teaching this to talk one course to undergraduates, and they are at the very beginning of their researcher life, if at all. So everything is new for them, and they don't have any idea of what a research question could be in literary studies or whatever. And so they don't have a need for models, and so they are basically not interested in data modeling at all. And I would be glad to find a way around that.
Speak a little to that in terms of literary studies, because I would never, in my department, I don't think we would ever have a class per se on data modeling. Yet, I think it's absolutely crucial for literary studies courses to incorporate digital humanities tools, and that's what I think I'd like to see, perhaps a gap narrowed there. And so for my classes, I think what Sid brought up, many undergraduates who are majors in English in my college, or in different colleges where I've taught, would not feel patronized if they were asked, what would you use to gather your photographs? What would you use to gather your documents? What online tool would you be comfortable with using? And that would be a wonderful way in to get them to think about how it is to translate that to the analysis of literary texts. One tool that I have been using more frequently is the Electronic Literature Organization's directory, which is something I've been a member of for a few years now, where it's not, it's a wonderful resource in terms of gathering scholarship and information about works of electronic literature, net art, digital art, etc. But it's also a great pedagogical tool for undergraduate literature students. It gives them the opportunity to engage with these texts, write an entry, go through a peer review process, but at the same time, they're responsible for tagging their own entries. They're responsible for thinking about how these texts that they're looking at are broken down and how they might translate that to other people. So it's something that I think is something of an overlap. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got two different types of setup here. Yeah? I mean, you're teaching digital humanities, and we two are sort of trying to integrate more or less everything into our literature or linguistics classes. And so I agree with you. In my context, at the moment at least, I cannot see separate classes for across the humanities, for example. If I want to do anything about digital humanities, then I have to do it in an integrated way. Now, I'm all for the integrated way anyway, also with academic paper writing, for example. There are all these courses in service centers and things like that, and I think they just cannot work. So the best thing is to bind it all up with a topic of a seminar, and then they have got a research question, because in a traditional German seminar, you always have to write a paper on a certain topic, and then you have to collect information like sources and bibliographical data, and you have to work on a structure and all these sort of things. Now, I break this all down into individual elements, and then in order to make people more conscious about this whole process and what they're actually doing, and consistencies and structures. And I mean, an academic paper is anyway a very structured document. So, I mean, there's not much arty-farty going on in this context. You have to do it in a certain way. Yeah? But to make it conscious why it has to be done in a certain way, because it has to be scientific, and data have to be explicit and all these sort of things. I think their sort of markup and databases can actually help a lot to make students conscious about what they're actually doing, and by the same time they learn something about digital humanities. So it's all in one pot. Let's call it.
Yeah, so on the question of what can we teach that's abstract, I teach a course called Foundations of Information Modeling. At the beginning of the course, I say, you will not learn information modeling in this course. This course is about the foundations of information modeling. We then spend 5 weeks learning all of the logic, we review discrete mathematics, elementary formal language theory, some hierarchy, how DTDs grow out of extended DNF, and extended DNF is related to original DNF. We look at the relational model, we learn relational algebra, and one of the 2 calculi, neither of which is implemented in software, all on paper. I tell my students, you want to learn SQL? Drive the orders, buy a book, that's what grown-ups do. That's what I did, you can do it too. I do believe that learning data modeling actually is best done in the workplace, not in a classroom. So our students are master's students. They have they're here for about 18 months. It's like their last 18 months in school for the rest of their life. And I don't want them doing in the classroom that they can do far better in the workplace with the gurus and projects and deadlines, up-to-date software, and paper too. This is their last chance to learn theoretical foundations. So we focus on things like that. And they have to have some background. I have been acquainted just barely with relational databases and conceptual modeling, so I'm not seeing these things for the first time. But when we do conceptual modeling, we concentrate on how to translate rectangles and parallels to the first order logic, so we can understand what the underlying model is, regardless of how it's happening. So I think that there's a lot, that we can do to prepare students for becoming good data modelers. And I actually think that preparation is not learning data modeling. It's learning fundamental principles that are going to serve you for the rest of your life.
I don't want to take this course.
I think that should be the next funded project, is Alan teaching all of it.
I think that's great, and I think that's really important, but I think one of the other themes that we're hearing here is that there isn't necessarily such a hard and fast line between data modeling as we perceive that in digital humanities is something that's part of our practice, and very very traditional pedagogical goals of learning the methods and practices of research and, you know, literary formalism or linguistic categories. Those are, in essence, themselves data modeling, always have been, long before the computer. And we refashion that in some ways when we bring digital technologies to it, at the same time as there's also a continuum, right? So it's kind of like there are two goals here, which, you know, in some ways they're at odds, and then in other ways maybe they're potentially complementary, where we see data modeling almost as an end in itself, something that you know, fits within the digital humanities, something that we do because we're building projects or building you know, building resources. Yet on the other hand, it's not really an end in itself, it's also a means to another end that's anchored within a discipline. And so, you know, I just want to put that on the table because I think that's, you know, that's, if we don't keep in mind that there's that aspect to it, then we're just going to be very confused about what we're trying to do.
What I was commenting on Ferguson about how to give research question for students that are too young to have a research question. I don't think you can. What you can do is to ask them to model for a public, for a specific target. You say, okay, build a website for this public. And that, once they start to do that, they can do because they have experience of the web, then it can make them reflect that what they have done, they are actually answered to research question that this particular public will have. So it is a way around. It's very good.
I think we heard different aspects, right? I think this theory thing is something really important. Learning how something like XML XSLT is done practically is also very important. But there is also one aspect that I think is missing is there should also be something like, of course, like the practical history of data, right? Because especially, I don't know, if I look at myself, I learned that in the 1990s, and there were a lot of different communities which essentially wouldn't talk to each other. And if you were a relational guy, the would not talk to you, and vice versa. And there was also graph guys, which were in the 1960s, so they were already dead or their dead. And so when we had a really hard time to actually trace the way down to say new librarians in the University Library of Flanders in 1936, because there was just no book where somebody said, there was this guy, he had an idea, which we now know, or something like that, right? So I think the history is not written yet. And I mean the practical history, not how the theory evolved, but actually how that was implemented and what worked out and what didn't. And I think that's the very, very interesting part, which is also something we can teach the students that to, as you said, it's not only interesting what can be done, but the most interesting question is actually what can't be done, because that will raise research questions and actually new developments in the students.
I wonder if those librarians and archivists, this is sort of a question to Lonjan, and I want to let you ask her a question, but it just occurs to me to ask the librarians and archivists in the room whether there's a distinctive role for that community in a pedagogical mode, even though you may or may not actually teach courses in that sense. So, sorry.
Well, librarian is in my title, but I was actually going to just throw out an idea that I tried in a class before I got this job. When I was teaching the history department at UVA as a grad student, I tried to create a class that would get students thinking about the ways in which we record information and how that changes over time. And so we went to the rare books room and we looked at printed manuscripts. We set type and in a book school on a printing press, and then I also took them up to 9s and they looked at XSLT and we georeference maps. But for the database section, which is my, what I know best and what I do, relational databases, I gave them some basic readings on what are databases, how are they constructed. But then their assignment was to go and find one of the secondary source websites that they were, or primary source websites they were using to research their papers. Start putting in some search terms and write me up 2 paragraphs on how they thought the database was answering their queries. Could they tell if there was a clear relevancy to how the responses were, what responses they were getting back. Were they finding certain functionality built in, or did it seem like there were certain things missing from the underlying model? And we had a really, really great class when they came back, because they demoed all these sites to the other students, so the students learned about all these other sources they could be looking at. But then we got into this great conversation about, well, they could find this subject term, but it couldn't find that subject term. Or, you know, I was looking around and I finally found one that would really support some kind of Boolean argument that I was trying to create. And I think maybe it got them thinking about how the stuff that they interact with all the time has been modeled. And what they're getting back when they go and ask their research questions of these other materials is in fact being partially predetermined for them. And so how can they start to work that into their research? And we didn't do any programming. They didn't build any databases. But I told them a little, taught them a little bit about databases, and then I let them loose on some databases to see what came back.
Gina said it perfectly. I wanted to point out that I'll be the anti-Allen here and say that code studies is a kind of area which might well be brought into teaching data modeling, because it's trying to look at sort of theorizing and making the ideologies that are going into something as simple as writing code. And some of the papers that we've heard even at DH have a lot to do with looking at how databases are constructed or how knowledge systems are constructed, and how, you know, that is created, that's created by the people who do it, and kind of focus on that aspect of the knowledge representation. So, yes, what she said.
I guess I'd like to just add to that very quickly to say that that's precisely the kind of thing that I would love to see gathered, consolidated, you know, best practices, successful case studies, that type of thing. And I've gone on record once now, and this is the second time I'll go on. I think it's so vital that so many of us who are teaching in the humanities, who want to incorporate these types of techniques, have a very kind of wonderfully rich but distributed resource, right? And so I'm very tempted to put in an application for NEH Startup Grant to have such a place, you know, for teachers in the humanities, best case practices for using these things in our classrooms, what works, what doesn't, what's been disastrous, what's been a wonderful success, etc. And I think that would be something we would all benefit from.
In this respect, there is a wonderful resource made by Mrs. Spiro about the syllabi on the digital humanities around the world. It's a lot of about teaching digital humanities. It is in Zotero. And this Zotero group about teaching digital humanities, I just wanted to point it out because it's really amazing.
Good. Follow up to what Ellie and Jean said. Okay, so follow up to what Ellie and Jean said. There's one interesting thing which we didn't talk about on these 1.5 days, which also is somehow not quite data modeling, but actually is, which is ranking and other things in databases, right? Because they have a similar effect. So if you query something, right? So you do something over the data model and it gives you something back, and the database engine then ranks something, I say PageRank. That has an effect, especially if you're while entering data, right? That has an effect how you treat your database in the very same way as the configuration of the static data model has. There's, for example, one effect, right? So if you have a Powerball distribution of how frequent certain or how much information there is at a certain thing, once you use this kind of PageRank process, your Powerball will get steeper and steeper, right? Which is a big problem, right? Because you concentrate on Mona Lisa ever more, right? And I think that's something which is as relevant, and that's something I think it would be a good example in this discussion of education, right? There are certain fields which we can cover, right? Because we're specialists on, say, on data models, on particular languages and whatever. But there's these other things out there where we have thousands of engineers in Google working on it every day, right? Which have as strong as an effect. And the question is, how can people prepare for that gap? Because if they go somewhere, say they join a company, they do websites with XML, they will be confronted with that. that basically the influence of that patriot mechanism, for example, is way stronger on how people browse their website than their data model.
Yeah, I wanted to react quickly on two aspects why there is kind of a feedback. The one thing is the thread between Fotis and Elena concerning the research question. Sometimes you can't, and because, like you said, you've got students, but you need to keep this in mind in a way, and that's also an answer to your question, how do you teach to archivists and librarians? Because I did this seminar in Stefan's institute last year, where we included a diary of a woman in the 1940-1941, and was quite a successful seminar at the end of the day. But we started by saying, look, you're putting yourself in the skin of someone responsible for putting together digital edition in a library, and you need to identify your target. Let's imagine it's useful for the historian. Do the edition and model your data in such a way that you know the limit, what you can do and what the historian will do afterwards. Typical case is modeling persons. So I saw once an entry of blah blah blah, some objective infos like you would have in the National Library database, and then Nazi. Say, hey, why did you write that? No, because it's said in the document. Yeah, but that's this woman saying about this sort of person is a Nazi. The historian has to decide. It's not your job to put those kind of features. You let the others. The other point is concerning end of the story. The other one is concerning getting your hands dirty. And I spoke about confidence you need to give to the students. One of the messages I gave this time was to people in literature. So no technical background at all. And I said the objective of the course is at the end, we can go to a computer sciences and say, I want this, this, this. I don't want to bother it, but that's the kind of data I want as input, as output, and that's it. And we should be looking for. So you need to know enough of the technology to give orders, because you've got the science. The computer scientist is done. It will never understand what in your field. This is an important aspect.
That's very interesting. I mean, one of the things that your comment reminds me is that the digital humanities community does data modeling at least two levels. There are some of us whose job is to model data on behalf of others, right? We're in effect consultants. And there are others of us who are modeling on behalf of ourselves.
Of our research.
Yeah, our own research, exactly. We are the scholars, we are in charge of our project.
Or both.
Well, and some of us are both, sure, absolutely. But the point is that there are these two different ways in which data modeling functions in digital humanities, and I wonder whether the teaching exercise is inflected by that. Because I'm aware, I teach a course in electronic publishing, which is secretly data modeling at the Library School in Illinois. And what I have my students do is pretend to have a project, right? So they have to follow the modeling exercise through schema development, including samples, document analysis, designing a publication, and so forth. And I ask them to use a project of their own, right? To come up with some project that they care about, because as has already been observed, it gives them a greater sense of investment in the outcome. But I've often thought that I would really like to be able to teach them how to take anybody's data and think interestingly in a kind of vicarious way. You see what I mean? In other words, teach people to kind of project their imagination into somebody else's data and try to understand what those other motives might be. And I don't know, how one might go about teaching that, or whether it's just the same set of skills.
I would say you need to have some experience in the first to progressively get the pleasure in looking at someone else's data. Step by step is something which is...
Or maybe it's just a matter of temperament. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say that I teach a course and have for a long time, somewhat like Laurent, and also in answer to your question, Fotis, and also in answer to you, Julia, it seems to me that what happens is, and I'm teaching students from a wide variety. I taught this in the library school and now in digital humanities, that in a way they get sucked into the content. So I don't tend to, sorry for all the medievalists here, pick something medieval. I do pick fairly contemporary. A, it's what I'm interested in, but B, it's something that they can relate to. And I have a class going on right now, and they're totally sucked into the content areas and doing research that, I mean, I wouldn't have even thought to ask them to do. So, but they're coming up now with the research questions because now they're so engaged with the content that they're moving forward without me. So I find that way works for it very well. I just wanted to go back to maybe a couple things that were said in terms of how do you kind of abstract maybe in a way that's different. And I was again thinking of one of Willard's models of, say, something like representation. And so if you teach something called representation, I mean, Trevor was talking about representation in his whole talk. That's one way of representing. You were talking about representing literature through visualization tools. Jonathan Stray has a fabulous article about representing the Iraq war logs and the inherent issues with the algorithms that were used to create the representation and how that inflects or influences our way of reading it. And so I'm wondering if there are ways to, again, kind of go up one level and say, okay, we're going to do representation, or maybe not even say that, and teach about all the ways we use data in ways of representing our information in the world we live in, but then finding some ways for them to begin to move to the next step of kind of modeling that themselves and realizing how their model affects the ultimate representations at the final point of whatever visuals they're looking at, or even within the encoding itself, if you're thinking of something like XML.
Just want to ask, we have opinions at the moment of schools. One says the best way is to learn data modeling by doing something concrete, XML, so on. Next one would be to teach concepts of specific subject areas and disciplines in a formalized way, or more concentrate on the more formal concepts and go from there to maybe some technical aspects. And the third would be Alan's way to say, don't do this at all, just start from start a foundation. Everybody who has a strong foundation can go from there, and maybe you can point out to us why the things you mentioned, first order logic and so on, they are the foundation for the kind of data modeling we were talking about. Because in a way, we could say we had different concepts of data modeling in this room in the last 2 days, and what you are seeing as foundations seem to be applicable only to a very small subset of this. But this may be a wrong understanding, so maybe you could explain the selection. But I wanted to have this question and the other one. We have 3 different approaches at the moment, and I just want to say, are they 3 approaches both equal and well, or is it just as it happens, or do we have preferences now that we see them next to each other?
I don't see them as exclusive. They all hang together. So, okay, let's go from a discipline. You have a particular object, you want to model a text, and you have a particular interest in the text, it's a literary interest. Yeah? That's a very abstract thing. So you have to, in order to analyze a text, let's say from a literary perspective, you have a set of analytical methods, and you have some model you apply. I'm not talking about digital. Yeah? You have some model. Now, to make things digital, you need a computational model of what they do. Yeah? And there, I come back to what you said. So once you want a computational model, you have to know the foundations of computational modeling. And that's why you need this type of information as well. So it all hangs together. So you have to do everything. I'm sorry.
That's always a good solution.
I feel like I'm puzzling over the question you just posed for 10 years. How much to go toward Alan's lofty conceptual foundation play, and how much to focus on sort of working inside of the tool. And so, I think we all try to negotiate that in various ways. But one thing I can conceptual way of teaching that not relational databases, but relational calculi is a sort of like a kind of safer place for us to be professional. And if we're not totally free here in a way, because it can be very hard to get a course on XML into the curriculum. It can be very hard to get a course on XML, get that course approved. Start talking about foundations of information theory, and suddenly and I think on one of the panels, forgive me, I think one said it, usually, I teach this course, but it's secretly this, so I mean, we're doing this all the time, and sometimes we're trying to slip in the theoretical and the practical, and sometimes we're trying to slip the practical and the theoretical. But either way, these are not, the playing field is not exactly even here, what we're talking about.
Also, Julia's dean is Alan.
What's that?
Julia's dean is Alan.
Okay, well, that solves the problem. I just need to teach at a different institution.
So I'll say that when I introduced this course, we had lots of courses. We had courses on database design, system design, XML, and so on. So this was a deliberate effort to introduce a course that provided the theoretical foundation. And I believe, my colleagues were believe that our students would produce much better systems, throughout their career. They would learn textbooks faster, they'd understand them better, they'd understand them from inside. And I did kind of feel I had one chance, 18 months, the last 18 months in the classroom. This was a good opportunity to learn these things. Otherwise, and I feel like I watch students look at an ER diagram and realize there are rectangles and arrows, and they don't know what they mean. They don't know what they mean. This often comes up in your debate over what graphic modeling language to use. And you realize it's being carried out about features that are truly irrelevant. And the features that are irrelevant are completely that aren't seen by the students. So that was part of the frustration for thinking our students need to understand what's really going on when they're data modeling, if they're going to learn these data modeling languages and learn them well and build them inside. And specifically quickly about the two. So one categorization approach that came up here was pragmatic versus theoretic. And I'm not sure that I recognize any prejudice with respect to foundational stuff. I'm a very theoretic, I've been a pragmatic modeler most of my life. I'm a very theoretic modeler now. When I do modeling, I believe I'm doing digital humanities just like Aristotle did. I'm doing it too. We're doing it. And he wasn't trying to build systems, and I don't know. Not anymore. So I think of it as relevant to that, but I also see it as relevant to learning XML and ER modeling and modeling relational associated, just as relevant to that more computational. So I don't see it as particularly relevant. I don't see any more relevant to computational pragmatic modeling than to theoretic modeling. Now there may be other perspectives that would be prejudiced towards, but not that one. I don't know what you have in mind exactly.
Oh yeah. I thought that maybe there is some implicit argument in what you said. Maybe I thought that there is maybe an implicit argument for saying, taking up the distinction by Elisabeth. We have data modeling, and then there's a subgroup of computational data modeling. And what you're talking about is lying about the foundations of the computational data modeling, and that would be the foundation for all data modeling. And that was the way I was trying to clear this up.
So I'll just reiterate, I don't see myself as particularly focused on foundations for computational data modeling. If you want to simply understand a domain, regardless of your digital plans for managing data in that domain, then
this too, because I think Steve is absolutely right about a lot of departments. I would say that's definitely true for example, the English department where I teach, but I also teach in an I-school. And I would say it's actually, my experience is it's sort of the inverse, that it's much easier to get a course to fly, especially at the core level, if it's something like a basic technology course, a basic programming course, and so forth, or cataloging. I once taught classification theory, which was a survey of classificatory principles across the different disciplines, so biology, philosophy, linguistics, and then challenges from fields like cognitive science. And it was a blast, but I've only been able to teach it once. And because I think this maybe applies to a lot of professional schools, that if you're teaching in a professional school, then very hands-on education is what counts.
Well, and that's especially interesting given the set of decisions that are being made now about whether graduate programs in digital humanities are construed as professional schools.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for example, when people ask me, where are the graduate programs in digital humanities, and I do my sort of annual look through, I'm always astonished by how many of them are specifically aimed at least marketing themselves as providing practical training for people who are going to be working in areas like media, as opposed to people who are going to be teaching humanities subjects. And I think at least this is in the United States, and I'd be really interested in how the landscape might be different in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. Yeah.
We think about graduate programs. What about undergraduate programs? We don't teach an undergraduate program, but we teach some modules that people can plug in within their own program, major, and whatever. There is a big debate we are having within King's whether or not institute an undergraduate program in digital humanities. And my hypothesis has always been to do a minor, connected as more or less as you do, guys, in Würzburg. So to have, someone take a major in English or in French, and they do a minor in digital humanities, which is a methodological approach to there. But my new director, Andrew Prescott, has a completely different idea. His idea is that the discipline does not exist if it doesn't have a major, a single honor in the undergraduate level. So if we cannot provide a single honor in digital humanities is not a discipline. So there is a debate, a large debate that we would like to start now. We just started a debate at King's, but we hope to use the Digital Humanities Conference in Hamburg and the panel that we are both in on teaching digital humanities to start this debate to say, what would you fit within a digital humanities single honor for undergraduate level? Which kind of person, which kind of professional or non-professional profile are you trying to create? Someone that goes out there and is able to do a website, or someone that goes out there and is able to be a librarian, or does research after what someone that has graduated in digital humanities will do. I come from an experience from Italy, from Pisa, which there is a very healthy undergraduate digital humanities, which is more the first, I said, the former approach. So create some professional, someone that is able to do a localization of software, for instance, a technical writer of software, or web designer, or something like that. And this is what digital humanity has been, and it works very well. People get a job, they're very happy, there are lots of people, etc. But my question is that the only approach? Is that the professionalizing, creating the professional humanities person, someone that has a lot of humanities background, but also the technique to do something with that, is what we want to create? Or we want to create a small researcher? So everybody is a researcher, because we do think more or less at that respect of what we do. What we do is more or less research. So I was wondering if this is the only thing. That's my question.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad that you're posing a question that way. Generally, in conference and homework, I think that would be really good. And one of the things I'd like to see asked in that context is, what do we mean by asking this question? When we ask this question, do we imply that, for example, an English major or a history major is bound for a particular professional track? When we ask this question, do we assume that a discipline, a new discipline, needs to create a space in the economic marketplace for itself before it can be recognized? Because the economy is already divvied up among the majors that already exist, and therefore there's no call for a new discipline unless there's a new profession for it, right? And similarly, I think that the question has to do with the way in which we conceive the humanities as a whole, because as we know, there's been a crisis going on for years at the graduate level about whether all English graduate PhDs are going to be professors. I mean, is that a real assumption that we're actually making, or is this something that we're presuming as a kind of, you know, something in order to legitimize our activities without actually being able to deliver on it, right? So those questions are bound up in a lot of really, really interesting and important questions about what the academic programs are all about.
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting point. If you track, I mean, I'm not that old, but if you track it since the early 1980s, what you could get for a certain skill set, right? Being able to date model, being able to think computation, being proficient as a classical researcher in a particular field of humanities. In the 1980s, would have stood out like a rocket scientist, right? And there's people who became directors of museums with that. In the 1990s, you would probably get a tenure-track position as a researcher, but not a professorship, with that kind of thing, right? And then you would program, but still that was already a service position where you worked for some classical researchers who were not able to think computationally. And right now, if you I mean, look at the job descriptions of places, right? We get not even full payment. We get 60%, Europe leads on 50% positions, which nevertheless presuppose that you're able to code, you're able to do GIFs, you're able to work with large data sets, and so on. So you basically, if we teach people only the skill sets and not the theoretical background to do something, they will end up being service people and will have lousy jobs. Because there's so many people who do similar stuff, right? There's like media schools where you learn communication and all that stuff. And how many people do calibrate muscles of dinosaurs and all the parts, right? So, and that's also, that's the pool of people who compete with. So this is really depressing for people who are finished masters, PhDs, postdocs, right?
Some of the more interesting data modeling at the undergraduate level happens in the social sciences or can be applied better in the social sciences. There was an effort here from the computer science department, which actually already colors what I'm about to say, who were trying to find out what social scientists and humanists wanted if there was going to be either a minor or some kind of component of the undergraduate education that was CS-like or CS-like. And the answer for the social sciences was easy. They taught them how to analyze the speeches of presidential candidates using text analysis software and things like that. The humanists were intractable. It was impossible to get the humanists to say what they wanted because they could not conceive, the faculty couldn't conceive of what they did in a way that was tractable to the computer scientists. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but this is the story. But what was being taught to the social scientists is what we talk about a lot. It's just that the humanities faculty don't think it's interesting. And the computer science faculty ended up teaching a lot of word counting in Moby Dick because they did find some humanities students and they did find some humanities classes and they know how to count things and they know how to do statistics on them and that was applying computers and computing and technology to humanities subjects. But of course, I don't think the humanities faculty care about that one bit.
How long ago was that?
About 2 years ago.
Only 2 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
15 years ago.
It's interesting to see what other people think is digital humanities. Yeah. What the humanists who are not digital think is digital, might be digital humanities. And our few digital humanists kept saying, we want to do text encoding, we think it's interesting. And the CS faculty thought that was really boring, and they didn't want to do that. So, also communication. Anyway, that's the story about trying to get it down into the undergraduate curriculum. The social sciences, it works. And what they do is what you talk about.
I just wanted to tell you something about an example, and I got an email a few days ago. One of these students who actually went through this project, she wrote back to me and she said, okay, I've got a job in a big German firm, which is nothing to do with digital humanities or anything like that. But as she knows how to write, wait a minute, she knows how to write a text by using the computer in a professional way, and she has learned XML. She got this job and she's completely happy about it. So, I mean, even just humanities can lead to a good professional start in life, I think.
We are all very helpful. We hope that.
Yeah, because people have got something else. They bring a lot of other things with them, and they get trained on in the firm in the end more and more specifically, and they're trainable.
Not only that, but somebody needs to know Greek.
Somebody.
You are.
Oh, yeah.
Generation, you are that person.
I was just sitting with 3 people who knew Greek better than I did.
I think it is time for a break. So
I have an announcement before the break. Can I? I'm putting a new hat, that is the one of the TI board at the moment. I'm very glad to announce that, to save the date, the next TI members meeting, I know you can't wait for that. It will be held in at Texas A&M University from the 7th to 11th of November. A formal announcement will be followed tonight on the TI list.
And we can congratulate the future chair of the scientific committee for this conference.
Thank you. I've never done it, so I hope I will do a good job. So just forgive me. But that's it. I'm bound to announce publicly. You are the first in the world to know that. That's 7th, 11th November at Texas A&M. The host will be Laura Mandel, of course, and there will be the TI members meeting this year. Thank you.